Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? Now breathe slowly and consider this. Among the beings that drift in the dark beyond stars, one has always stood apart. Not because it is the most powerful, not because it is the most terrifying, but because it is the most misunderstood. We've seen its name whispered in ancient ruins, hinted at in half-lost texts, reimagined through films, games, and fiction. And yet, despite 100 appearances, it never stays still. No fixed form, no clear motive, only masks, only voices, only silence when you most need answers. Tonight, we look at the one who speaks while others sleep, the one who walks among us while the rest drift in blind chaos. And the truth we'll uncover is simple. The more we try to explain it, the more we betray how little we ever understood. Its followers think they know. Scholars pretend to. Creators reshape it to fit their fears. But none of them ask the question that matters. What if misunderstanding is the point? We begin not with answers, but with silence, deception, and origin. To understand why this entity refuses clarity, we must go back. Before Lovecraft, before myth, before language. Let us begin with history. The mistakes were made there first. The figure we are examining did not emerge from nowhere. It appeared at a precise moment in history, shaped by pressures that were intellectual as much as personal. In the years following 1918, Western culture faced a collapse of confidence. World War I had shattered belief in progress. Science had displaced religion without offering comfort, and new physics suggested a universe hostile to human intuition. Lovecraft was writing inside this rupture. Born in 1890, and publishing most actively during the 1920s, he absorbed a world where old certainties failed quietly. This context matters because the being we now debate was never designed as a monster in the traditional sense. It was conceived as an expression of cultural disorientation. Lovecraft's letters make this intent clearer than his fiction alone. He repeatedly rejected moral storytelling, insisting instead on cosmic indifference. According to his correspondence from the early 1920s, horror should arise from scale, not cruelty. Within that framework, most cosmic entities remain distant and inert, yet this one does not. That difference is deliberate. Lovecraft introduced a figure that communicates, persuades, and manipulates, not as a villain, but as a function. This reveals something profound. The true horror, for Lovecraft, was not destruction, but comprehension. A universe that notices us is more disturbing than one that ignores us. We must pause here and address a common mistake. Readers often treat this entity as a personality, even a character. That reading misunderstands Lovecraft's method. He did not create individuals in the modern sense. He constructed narrative pressures. This figure operates as an interface between humanity and forces too abstract to appear directly. Consider this carefully. Most outer gods are unreachable, but this one arrives, speaks, and demonstrates. It embodies mediation itself. This role reflects contemporary fears surrounding new authorities, scientists, broadcasters, political demagogues who translated complex systems into persuasive language. The first appearance of this being in 1920 is telling. The prose poem Nyarlathotep presents a public exhibition, not a secret ritual. Crowds gather, machines hum, knowledge spreads, madness follows. The setting mirrors early 20th century fascination with electricity, radio, and public lectures. Lovecraft was responding to a culture where information traveled faster than understanding. Compared to figures like Cthulhu, who sleeps and waits, this entity acts immediately, not destruction, but revelation, not force, but persuasion. The distinction is crucial. Lovecraft's personal psychology also shaped this creation. He distrusted mass movements and modernity, yet he was fascinated by them. This tension surfaces here. The figure is not chaos incarnate, but order weaponized. It brings coherence where none is safe. Similar anxieties appear in contemporaries like Kafka, whose bureaucracies crush through clarity, and Machen, whose revelations destroy belief. But Lovecraft goes further. He suggests that explanation itself can be fatal. By the mid-1930s, Lovecraft refined this idea across multiple texts. The entity became less visible, more symbolic. Masks replaced forms, roles replaced bodies. This evolution suggests a shift from spectacle to implication. The being no longer needed description. Its function was established. It reveals, translates, and destabilizes. Not evil, but inevitable. This intent is often lost in later interpretations that demand fixed rules and hierarchies. This historical grounding leads us forward. To understand why this figure took its final shape, we must examine the older ideas Lovecraft drew from mythic, philosophical, and cultural sources that predate him entirely. That is where we turn next. To understand why this being behaves unlike any other in the mythos, we must look further back, before Lovecraft, before horror fiction as genre, to the cultural and philosophical strands that informed its creation. This figure is not just a literary invention. It emerges from a longer tradition of shape-shifting messengers, divine deceivers, and philosophical destabilizers. Its function is old. Lovecraft merely clothed it in modern language. Begin with mythology. The most obvious allusion is to the gods of ancient Egypt, particularly Thoth, Set, and Anubis, figures associated with writing, judgment, and liminality. Though Lovecraft claimed no deep study of Egyptian religion, he borrowed its aesthetic strategically. The name Nyarlathotep sounds like a forgotten pharaoh, evoking dusty tombs and imperial rituals. But this resemblance masks deeper influence from another tradition, the trickster archetype. This being joins the lineage of Hermes, Loki, and Eshu, not as a comic foil, but as a mediator between realms. It travels, it deceives, and it reveals. But unlike its mythic predecessors, it offers no lesson. Philosophically, we find deeper roots in Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of truth and morality. In On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, 1873, Nietzsche describes truth as a mobile army of metaphors, a human construction imposed on an indifferent world. Nyarlathotep performs a similar function. It delivers information, yes, but warped, destabilized, half-true. Not knowledge as enlightenment, but knowledge as contagion. Compare this to the Gnostic concept of the demiurge, a lesser god who traps souls in illusion by crafting a false reality. Both distort perception. Both preserve order for a deeper chaos. This brings us to a critical shift in the early 20th century: epistemological anxiety. Western thought had entered an age of disintegration. Darwin had displaced divine purpose. Freud had questioned the self. Einstein had fractured absolute time and space. In such a context, the fear of incomprehensible deities gave way to a subtler dread, the fear that comprehension itself might be impossible. Nyarlathotep emerges here, not as a destroyer, but as the one who confirms our worst suspicion, that our minds were never meant to grasp what lies beyond. We must also consider the literary lens. Lord Dunsany, whom Lovecraft admired deeply, crafted dreamlike narratives filled with strange gods and poetic logic. His stories often feature distant cities, ambiguous travelers, and a tone of sacred indifference. Lovecraft adapted this tone but sharpened it with sharper tools: scientific skepticism, racial unease, and psychological collapse. Where Dunsany offered reverie, Lovecraft offered entropy. Nyarlathotep is not born of dreams, but of dreams turning toxic. There is also a political undercurrent. Lovecraft witnessed the rise of charismatic orators, figures like Hitler, Mussolini, and American demagogues, whose power lay not in truth, but in performance. The 1920 prose poem that first introduces this being does not depict it in temples or under moons. It shows it on stage, giving lectures, operating devices, captivating crowds. This is not mythic distance. It is terrifying familiarity. The god speaks your language. That is what makes it dangerous. Finally, we must acknowledge the influence of theosophy and occult revivalism, popular in Lovecraft's time. While Lovecraft dismissed mysticism publicly, he drew from its language cycles, emanations, veiled truths. He did not believe in these systems, but he recognized their symbolic utility. Nyarlathotep becomes a parody of spiritual revelation. It grants visions, but no peace. It opens the mind, but only to erase it. What emerges from this web is not a single source, but a pattern. Across religion, philosophy, and modernity, this figure absorbs the role of messenger without message. It channels the terror of unstable knowledge. As we move forward, we must examine how even its name participates in this strategy, how language itself becomes part of the horror. A name like Nyarlathotep resists translation. This is not accidental. In Lovecraft's world, names are more than labels. They are traps, distortions, warnings. Nyarlathotep is not derived from any real language, though it echoes the phonetic structure of ancient Egyptian. Its syllables suggest something arcane, yet invented. The name does not reveal, it obscures. This reflects Lovecraft's deeper strategy, to construct mythic resonance through sound, not etymology. The horror lies in almost recognizing the name, in mistaking it for something ancient when it is, in fact, a mask. Compare this with other figures in the mythos: Cthulhu, Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath. All exhibit phonetic irregularities. They do not resemble Indo-European naming conventions. Instead, they evoke linguistic disruption. This is a tactic. Language in Lovecraft's hands becomes a signal of the unknowable. Where traditional horror names like Dracula or Frankenstein imply heritage, Lovecraft's names imply dislocation. Nyarlathotep, in particular, walks a fine line. It hints at cultural origin, Egypt, while denying any actual semantic link. This deliberate ambiguity enhances the figure's role as a deceiver. We must pause and consider how Lovecraft used language as atmosphere. He often wrote names that felt ancient but offered no clear meaning. This is not careless. It builds a semantic gap between reader and subject. Nyarlathotep's name functions like a glyph, suggestive but unreadable. It simulates the experience of encountering an alien script, familiar in form, illegible in meaning. The horror is not in the unknown, but in the almost known. You feel you should understand, but cannot. This linguistic approach mirrors real-world phenomena. In many cultures, divine or magical names are not spoken, only approximated. In Hebrew tradition, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, is sacred and unpronounced. In Islamic theology, certain names of God hold metaphysical power. Lovecraft, though a materialist, co-opts this ritual silence. By giving his most vocal outer god an untranslatable name, he inverts the usual logic. This is not a god to invoke, but one who invokes you. The symbolic function of the name deepens when we consider its thematic role. Nyarlathotep embodies miscommunication, distortion, and linguistic decay. Its name reflects these attributes. It is not merely hard to say, it is hard to hold in the mind. There are no consistent diminutives, no informal variants. Readers rarely abbreviate it. This signals something important. The name resists assimilation. It does not become part of language, it stays apart. Furthermore, the length and complexity of Nyarlathotep serve a structural purpose. It destabilizes rhythm. In prose, it interrupts flow. In speech, it resists ease. Even in silence, it looms as a linguistic aberration. Compare this to the elegance of Lucifer or the menace of Sauron. Lovecraft's invention lacks poetic compactness. It is an anti-name, a disruption embedded in text. In this way, the very act of naming becomes part of the horror. If Cthulhu symbolizes the alien and inert, Nyarlathotep symbolizes the deceptive and present. One is depthless slumber, the other surface noise, but neither offers comprehension. Both names do damage, just differently. And so, as we move forward, we must shift focus. The name is not the mask. The being wears many. To understand how Nyarlathotep builds belief around itself, we must now explore how Lovecraft constructed not just a character, but a myth. That is the next phase in this transformation. Nyarlathotep is not introduced with exposition. It arrives. It speaks. It is already known. From its first appearance, Lovecraft frames it not as a fictional invention, but as a recovered fragment of something older. This approach reflects a deeper technique, myth building through implied history. Rather than constructing myth through explicit lore, Lovecraft embeds it within the structure of narrative itself, suggesting, not stating, layering, not explaining. The result is a character who appears across stories without centrality, consistency, or closure, and yet feels deeply, even eerily, real. This realism is no accident. Lovecraft modeled his methods on the techniques of religious and folkloric transmission. Myths do not begin with definitions. They emerge through retellings, contradictions, and half-remembered accounts. In this way, Nyarlathotep is mythologized not by what it is, but by how often it appears without being explained. A name spoken in one story, a shape glimpsed in another. This fragmented presence creates the illusion of a shared world, one where the narrator is always too late or too afraid to understand fully. We must pause here. Many writers build worlds through maps, genealogies, and exhaustive lore. Lovecraft took the opposite path. He created narrative gaps. Characters mention books they have not read, cities they do not visit, beings they dare not describe. Nyarlathotep is often the endpoint of inquiry, the consequence of too many questions. This structure mirrors how real-world occult figures operate, always hidden behind intermediaries, rumors, and redacted texts. The reader becomes complicit, piecing together meaning from fragments. Lovecraft also borrowed structural techniques from academic writing. Stories like The Call of Cthulhu and the Dunwich Horror use scholarly frames, case files, oral histories, missing documents. In doing so, they mimic the authority of nonfiction. When Nyarlathotep appears in such a context, it inherits that authority. It is not introduced. It is cited. It exists before the story begins. This literary sleight of hand makes the myth feel discovered, not invented. Collaboration played a crucial role in extending this illusion. Lovecraft encouraged fellow writers to borrow and reinterpret his creations. August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, and others included Nyarlathotep in their tales, sometimes as a trickster, other times as a cosmic ambassador. These conflicting portrayals did not weaken the figure, they strengthened it. Inconsistency became a feature, not a flaw. Like folklore, the god grew more credible through variation. This mythic layering reached beyond fiction. Some readers, mistaking Lovecraft's citations for real sources, believed in texts like the Necronomicon or in locations like Ulthar. The line between fiction and forgery blurred. Occult enthusiasts and fringe theorists began citing Nyarlathotep in actual esoteric texts by the late 20th century. Though Lovecraft denied belief in the supernatural, his methods created a structure that invited belief, so built fiction that acted like myth and then stepped aside. Consider this carefully. In most mythologies, divine figures reveal themselves through dream, madness, or symbolic disorder. Nyarlathotep follows this tradition exactly. It does not argue for its own existence. It unsettles the narrative around it. As readers, we rarely witness the god directly. We see the aftermath, broken minds, missing bodies, corrupted texts. This absence becomes presence. The more indirect the appearance, the more powerful the implication. And so we arrive at a crucial transition. If myth relies on symbolic language and narrative gaps, how does it manifest in stories? What shape does Nyarlathotep take across the literature itself? The figure is not just an idea. It moves. It acts. To trace its development, we must now follow it into fiction. We begin with its earliest literary footprints. At the center of cosmic horror is not a creature, but a claim that human meaning is fragile, temporary, scaffolding suspended in an indifferent universe. Nyarlathotep embodies this claim, but with a twist. Where other outer gods represent brute indifference or blind destruction, this one operates through meaning, only to dissolve it from within. It doesn't shatter reality with force. It whispers, it smiles, it explains. Then, piece by piece, comprehension crumbles. The first and most familiar theme is insignificance. In Lovecraft's cosmos, there are no chosen people, no divine destinies, no cosmic justice. Yet Nyarlathotep speaks directly to humans. This is not consolation. It is escalation. If the stars burn without noticing us, we can endure it. But what if something does notice us and finds us laughably small? Nyarlathotep spoke much of the sciences, Lovecraft writes in the 1920 prose poem. He spoke of the stars, of the pits between the stars. This knowledge does not elevate the listener. It undoes them. The very act of being addressed confirms how utterly we fail to matter. Next is entropy, not just physical decay, but conceptual collapse. Most Lovecraftian entities are inert or slumbering, forces that wear down the mind through sheer scale. Nyarlathotep is different. It causes entropy through contact. When it appears, it introduces motion into systems meant to remain still. Cultures rot. Machines misfire. Languages lose precision. The result is not immediate death, but progressive disintegration. In The Haunter of the Dark, the narrator notes, "I have seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim. But this vision does not come unbidden. It is granted. The horror lies in the invitation to witness collapse." The third theme is the collapse of dream and reality. In stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Nyarlathotep rules over the dreamlands. But his power is not limited to fantasy. He uses dreams as channels, means of entering waking minds. The border between dreaming and waking dissolves. Readers expecting surrealism encounter instead overlap. The world becomes slightly misaligned. Nightmares do not haunt you in sleep. They arrive in daylight, in logic, in speech. Consider this. Lovecraft's dreams often inspired his stories directly. Nyarlathotep emerged from one such dream, a figure performing before a terrified crowd, trailing madness in its wake. When dream content births canonical terror, the boundary between worlds weakens. We must pause here. These three themes, insignificance, entropy, dream reality collapse, are not merely motifs. They are methods. Nyarlathotep does not kill characters in the conventional sense. It kills categories, good and evil, real and unreal, sane and mad. All begin to dissolve once it speaks. This is the most insidious form of horror, one that destroys your ability to frame horror at all. The philosophical roots of these themes are not limited to fiction. Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimism, Nietzsche's critique of meaning, and even Freud's theory of the unconscious all inform Lovecraft's design. But Nyarlathotep distills them into narrative form. He is not just a being, he is a proof. A mobile demonstration that meaning, when pushed hard enough, turns against itself. And yet, the being never says these things directly. That is key. It does not explain nihilism. It performs it. Each appearance reenacts the failure of understanding. Each witness suffers not from horror they see, but from what they realize. In this way, Nyarlathotep offers not a philosophy, but an experience of philosophy failing. As we transition to the next section, we must ask, what kind of being can perform this role? What sort of entity can speak for the unspeakable? To answer that, we must examine its manifestations, its forms, its functions, and the company it keeps among the outer gods. In the shifting cosmology of Lovecraft's mythos, most outer gods remain inert, forces without personality, presence without intent. Yog-Sothoth seethes at the center of chaos, blind and mindless. Shub-Niggurath spawns in infinite fertility, without reason or restraint. Yog-Sothoth surrounds all space and time, comprehending all but communicating nothing. In this landscape of vast indifference, Nyarlathotep is the singular exception. It speaks, it moves, it notices. This distinction is not decorative, it is structural. The entire framework of Lovecraft's metaphysics shifts when one of the old ones chooses to act. Yog-Sothoth represents pure cosmic entropy, a blind idiot god flailing without aim, accompanied by the piping of demonic flutes. Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, embodies total knowledge, but remains inaccessible, a paradox of omniscience beyond comprehension. These entities cannot be summoned in any practical sense. They are metaphysical. But Nyarlathotep is narrative. It interacts, it takes form, it adapts. Where the others remain symbols of unreachable extremity, Nyarlathotep becomes an intermediary, not a lesser god, but a functional one, a translation layer between incomprehensibility and the human mind. Consider Lovecraft's own phrasing. Nyarlathotep is the soul and messenger of the outer gods. That word, soul, is revealing. It implies centrality, perhaps even purpose. But the function of a soul, in this context, is not moral or metaphysical. It is performative. Nyarlathotep enacts what the others cannot. It dramatizes cosmic horror, and yet it never truly reveals the other. It distorts. It imitates. It brings clarity only to hollow it out again. We must pause here to examine its masks. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Nyarlathotep appears as a tall pharaoh, a form borrowed from Egyptian iconography, but stripped of its religious coherence. In the Haunter of the Dark, it is the occupant of a shining trapezohedron, a being glimpsed only through trembling visions and dim reflections. In other accounts, it takes the shape of a faceless man, a whispering prophet, a monstrous cloud, even a carnival figure performing impossible feats. Each mask reveals nothing essential, only a tailored reflection of what the viewer dreads most. This multiplicity of form is not versatility, it is strategy. Lovecraft grants Nyarlathotep the freedom to appear differently in each story, not to enrich lore, but to emphasize its core trait, deception through engagement. Where Cthulhu sleeps, Nyarlathotep attends. Where Yog-Sothoth exists outside time, Nyarlathotep intrudes upon it. And where Azathoth howls in the center of nothingness, Nyarlathotep walks among us, speaking in riddles that dismantle our categories of understanding. Its relationship to humanity is also unique. It does not ignore us as the others do. It targets us. It walks in cities, speaks in human languages, and induces madness not through scale, but through recognition. The horror lies not in what is alien, but in what is almost familiar. In this, Nyarlathotep does not resemble the gods of mythology. It resembles ideas, viruses, systems of meaning that replicate by lodging themselves into consciousness. This symbolic fluidity has led later writers to reinterpret Nyarlathotep in technological or post-human terms. In cyberpunk horror and existential sci-fi, it becomes the AI too vast to predict, the algorithmic system that simulates empathy while hollowing it out. This is a valid extension of Lovecraft's model. After all, the being's purpose is to represent the unrepresentable. That function has not diminished. It has simply migrated, and yet it belongs to a pantheon. It is not alone. Its role is inseparable from the others. Nyarlathotep performs the will of Azathoth, not as a priest or slave, but as a living interface. What the others are, it enacts. Its presence is not power in itself, but the translation of power. This makes it more dangerous than omnipotence. It is not divine force. It is divine access. As we proceed, we must ask, what happens when humans encounter such a being directly? How does the mind respond to contact with something designed not to kill, but to unmake thought itself? That is the next threshold we must cross. We now turn to madness, not as pathology, but as method. In most horror traditions, madness is consequence. In Lovecraft's framework, and especially in the case of Nyarlathotep, madness becomes instrument. It is not the side effect of fear, but the delivery system of the god's presence. Characters do not go mad because they see Nyarlathotep. They go mad because they listen. They try to understand. In this reversal, comprehension itself becomes corrosive. The mind does not collapse from pressure. It unravels from exposure. This inversion appears clearly in The Haunter of the Dark. Robert Blake, a curious writer, investigates a forbidden church, stares too long into the trapezohedron, and begins to receive dreams. The dreams are not violent, they are revelatory. He begins to understand something vast and terrible. I see things I never knew before, things I dare not think of, he writes in his final entry. Madness comes not from confrontation, but from context. As Blake connects each clue, coherence emerges and kills him. This pattern, curiosity, discovery, disintegration, repeats across the mythos. It is not punishment, it is process. Nyarlathotep exploits human desire to know. It offers knowledge, but never truth. The result is cognitive failure. Consider how this differs from trauma-based horror. In traditional Gothic tales, the mind cracks from grief, guilt, or supernatural interference. In Lovecraft's model, madness emerges when epistemology fails. You learn too much, and yet not enough. We must pause and distinguish Nyarlathotep's method from brute chaos. Cthulhu drives minds to collapse through dreams of drowning cities and alien geometries. Azathoth induces madness through sheer conceptual impossibility. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, speaks clearly. Its language is human. Its voice is calm. The message makes sense, at first. This is more dangerous. The mind breaks not from overload, but from inversion. The known becomes unstable. Categories reverse. Logic folds in on itself. What was metaphor becomes fact. What was symbol becomes presence. Scholars have noted this reflects a deeper psychological structure. In Freudian terms, Nyarlathotep is not the return of the repressed. It is the exposure of repression as a futile defense. In Jungian analysis, it may resemble the archetype of the shadow, but one that infects rather than integrates. And in existential terms, it represents the moment when constructed meaning disintegrates and the void is revealed behind it. But Nyarlathotep offers no tools for recovery. The madness it induces is terminal, not a disorder, but a new order, incompatible with human life. Examples in the wider mythos support this. In Derleth's expansions, witnesses of Nyarlathotep report intense visions, prophetic compulsions, and a sense of being seen. Unlike other entities that ignore humanity entirely, Nyarlathotep engages its victims. It communicates. This is not empathy. It is precision targeting. The horror lies in the specificity. The being seems to know exactly how to undo you. Personally, intellectually, existentially. The function of madness here is therefore structural. It is not a symptom to be avoided, but a threshold to be crossed. Contact with Nyarlathotep is not survivable, not because it kills, but because it remakes. The self cannot integrate what it reveals, and yet humans continue to seek it. This paradox, compulsion toward the source of cognitive ruin, drives much of the mythos. As we continue, we must examine what makes this encounter possible in the first place. What kind of knowledge is Nyarlathotep offering? What does it show? And why does showing it destroy the knower? This takes us deeper still, into the idea of forbidden knowledge, and the total collapse of understanding that follows. That is where we go next. In Lovecraft's mythos, forbidden knowledge is never merely hidden. It is inaccessible by design. It does not resist discovery because it is locked away, but because it undoes the framework through which we understand things. And among all the entities in this universe, Nyarlathotep is the one who offers this knowledge directly. It does not conceal, it reveals. But what it reveals is not enlightenment. It is epistemic collapse, the realization that knowledge itself can be false comfort. We must be precise. Nyarlathotep does not dispense secrets. It performs revelatory failures. Characters who seek knowledge, whether through books, devices, dreams, or rituals, encounter not answers, but overload. In the dreams in the witch house, the protagonist becomes aware of extra-dimensional geometries and equations that seem to work, but defy all human reasoning. In The Haunter of the Dark, the shining trapezohedron does not display a vision, it invites one. What follows is not understanding, but irreversible mental decomposition. The knowledge functions more like radiation than insight, invisible, penetrating, fatal. This reflects a deeper philosophical claim. Most belief systems treat knowledge as a form of power or salvation. Cosmic horror inverts this. The more you know, the worse your condition becomes. Nyarlathotep weaponizes this dynamic. Unlike Cthulhu, who can be imagined as sleeping to be avoided, Nyarlathotep deliberately communicates. It speaks in dreams, symbols, languages. It is said to bring visions of the stars, of alien histories, of future wars. But each of these gifts functions like a virus. Once received, they cannot be unthought. The damage is irreversible. We must pause to distinguish this from mere secrecy. In Gothic fiction, forbidden knowledge is often a locked room or cursed document, dangerous but manageable. In cosmic horror, especially in Nyarlathotep's case, the danger is structural. The mind itself is the weak point. There is no safe amount of exposure. The reader learns this through the text's architecture. Knowledge arrives without context, without warning, without exit. What begins as intellectual curiosity becomes existential collapse. This mechanism mirrors real-world psychological concepts. Cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile new information with old beliefs, appears frequently in these narratives. But with Nyarlathotep, the dissonance is not emotional, it is ontological. The world no longer fits together. Categories such as time, identity, or causality lose internal coherence. In modern philosophical terms, we would call this a failure of the epistemic frame, the system by which knowledge is structured. Nyarlathotep breaks that frame, not with malice, but as a kind of demonstration. A striking example appears in The Crawling Chaos, co-authored with Winifred Vi Jackson. The narrator experiences a vivid dream of beauty and flight, which slowly degrades into a vision of industrial collapse, cosmic decay, and existential ruin. Nyarlathotep, unnamed in the text but present in tone, orchestrates this journey from illusion to entropy. The character wakes not with insight, but with the sense that what he thought was real was simply a thin veneer over something incomprehensible and hostile. This reveals something profound. Nyarlathotep does not guard forbidden knowledge. It is forbidden knowledge, personified, mobile, seductive. To engage with it is to abandon the assumption that knowledge improves the knower. In a mythos where the cosmos is hostile to understanding, the being that teaches becomes the most destructive force imaginable. Its gift is not violence, it is awareness. And so we must ask, why do so many pursue it anyway? The stories are filled with scholars, artists, and dreamers who actively seek Nyarlathotep. The answer is not ambition, but compulsion. Once the mind senses that meaning exists beyond its grasp, it becomes unable to stop seeking. The trap is not the knowledge, it is the desire for it. Nyarlathotep does not lure, it waits. It allows the human need for coherence to do the work. This brings us to literature itself, for if the figure functions as a symbol of collapsing understanding, how does it manifest across stories? What narrative forms does it take? In our next section, we enter the literary realm, not to trace a biography, but to witness how myth decays into narrative, and narrative into interpretation. We follow the footsteps now. Nyarlathotep's first appearance was not in a sprawling myth cycle or densely plotted novella. It arrived in 1920 as a one-page prose poem titled Nyarlathotep, a surreal vision Lovecraft claimed was inspired by a dream. The piece has no traditional structure. It offers no clear antagonist. Instead, it evokes dread through suggestive progression. A wandering prophet, a performance of inexplicable science, and the collapse of the world around it. The narrator confesses, "I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the horror in the eyes of the men who walked with me through the silent night. This is not the unveiling of a monster, but the demonstration of one, an exhibition of intellectual corruption disguised as enlightenment." This short piece establishes Nyarlathotep as performer and communicator. It speaks, demonstrates, and captivates. Its strange instruments suggest pseudo-scientific devices, and its knowledge carries the tone of prophecy. But as the crowd follows, reality slips. Dreams blend with waking. Geometry dissolves. "There was no street," the narrator says, "and the lights went out." The prose collapses into absurdity, not by violence but by the slow, logical unraveling of perception. This establishes a core pattern. Nyarlathotep does not cause events. It frames them. It is the presence that makes understanding self-destruct. From this seed, Lovecraft expanded the being's presence across his fictional universe, not by continuity, but by strategic illusion. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, written 1926-27, Nyarlathotep reappears as a shape-shifting manipulator who presides over the courts of the Dreamlands. He is not merely a villain, he is the architect of disorientation. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, is lured through shifting dreamscapes by signs that seem promising, but ultimately lead to confrontation with cosmic truth. Nyarlathotep is the final gatekeeper, the one who reveals that Carter's desires were constructed traps. Crucially, the story describes Nyarlathotep as a guide who seemed to delight in the blasphemous paradoxes he whispered into men's ears. This delight is essential. It positions him not as a force of nature, like Cthulhu or Azathoth, but as an intentional corrupter. He orchestrates, narrates, seduces. The god's cruelty lies not in what it does, but in what it makes the protagonist realize. In this, it performs a meta-narrative function, representing not just chaos, but the horror of an ordered universe being exposed as fraudulent. Lovecraft never constructed a central Nyarlathotep story. Instead, the god's influence emerges through scattered references. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the Maigo worship the mighty messenger, and while unnamed, Nyarlathotep is implied as the intermediary between alien forces and Earth. In The Rats in the Walls, a mad ancestor mutters Nyarlathotep in his descent, a moment unconnected to the plot, but dense with implication. These cameos operate not as Easter eggs, but as epistemic rot. The name slips between stories, hinting that each narrative is only a fragment of a larger, unseen presence. This intertextual presence extends even to non-Lovecraftian characters. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, though Nyarlathotep is never directly mentioned, the structure of misleading knowledge, failed identity, and ancestral decay echoes his function. The absence is telling. Lovecraft builds his mythos not by saturation, but by negative space. The suggestion that every truth rests on buried contradiction. Nyarlathotep is that contradiction personified. As Lovecraft's stories grew more structurally complex, Nyarlathotep's appearances became less visual and more thematic. By the late 1930s, he no longer described the god's form at length. Instead, he let other characters mention the name in hushed tones, or describe effects that feel coordinated by a mind just outside the frame. The shift is significant. Nyarlathotep ceases to be a creature. It becomes a principle, a narrative virus capable of infecting tone, structure, and theme across unrelated texts. This evolution reveals a deeper strategy. Nyarlathotep is never a central character, but it is always the reason things happen. Whether it appears in dreams, as prophecy, or through forbidden language, it enacts the moment when characters believe they understand something and are immediately destroyed by the implications. The connective tissue across texts is not continuity, but epistemic failure. In this way, Nyarlathotep becomes the mythos's most insidious force. It does not rule, slay, or sleep. It moves, it mutates, it listens, and in doing so, it threads itself through the canon, not as deity, but as contamination. To trace this presence in full, we must now turn to two major case studies, stories in which its role crystallizes more clearly, even as the horror deepens. We begin with The Haunter of the Dark. The Haunter of the Dark stands as Nyarlathotep's most vivid and explicitly terrifying manifestation in Lovecraft's work. Written in 1935, it offers something unusual in the mythos, a story where the god's presence moves from implication to near-confirmed intrusion. Here, Lovecraft abandons the indirect symbolism of earlier texts and brings the reader to the edge of actual contact, and, still, the being remains elusive, not because it hides, but because perception itself fails to stabilize it. The story follows Robert Blake, a writer and amateur occultist drawn to a decaying Providence church once used by the Church of Starry Wisdom. Blake discovers the shining trapezohedron, a crystal through which worshippers could see the haunter, a being kept at bay by light and summoned by darkness. This setup appears conventional, a cursed object, a forbidden location, but the implications twist the familiar into the unmanageable. The haunter is never seen directly. It approaches, it dreams, it watches. Lovecraft's careful construction embeds epistemic instability into the structure of the story. Blake's descent into obsession mirrors the reader's. The more he learns, the more unclear everything becomes. He writes in his final diary entries, "I believe it is Nyarlathotep. The thing has summoned me. It speaks to me in dreams." Here we see the mythos, functioning not as lore, but as infection. The name enters. The self fractures. Blake does not die from physical assault. He dies from recognition, from seeing what should not be knowable, and realizing it has already seen him. The trapezohedron itself deserves special attention. Lovecraft describes it as a window on all time and space. This metaphor is central. The object does not contain Nyarlathotep. It permits perception. Its function is not containment, but interface. In modern terms, it behaves like a cosmic lens, an artifact that collapses distance between observer and observed. Through it, Nyarlathotep becomes present, not in form, but in influence. The story never tells us what Blake saw. It only gives us his final line, scrawled before his death, was lightning, that face, the window, the eyes. This minimalism is not restraint, it is strategy. By avoiding direct description, Lovecraft preserves the being's function, to destroy knowledge as it is formed. The more one tries to describe Nyarlathotep, the more it slips into metaphor. In The Haunter of the Dark, the horror is not the entity, but the realization that something entirely other is looking back. Critically, this story also reframes Nyarlathotep's narrative role. It is not simply the messenger of the Outer Gods, it is their bridge. The Haunter is the emissary, a term borrowed from political and theological structures. It does not act independently, nor does it obey commands. It represents. But what it represents is not readable. The reader is left with fragments, a forbidden church, a dead man, a crystal shattered by lightning. No revelation, no closure, only the haunting sense that understanding has failed entirely. The Haunter of the Dark also strengthens intertextual connections within the mythos. The Church of Starry Wisdom echoes earlier cults seen in the Call of Cthulhu. The references to the trapezohedron's Egyptian origins link back to the pseudo-historical framework developed in the Nameless City and The Outsider. Nyarlathotep becomes the nodal point where these scattered symbols converge. It is the fulcrum of mythos logic, never stable, always central. This story also reveals something about Nyarlathotep's tone. Unlike Cthulhu, whose awakening causes chaos, or Azathoth, who seethes without thought, Nyarlathotep orchestrates mood. The city dims, the sky darkens, the wind rises. Everything aligns with its arrival, not because it alters the world, but because the world responds. This grants the god an implicit narrative authority. It is not just a character, it is the event itself. And so, the Haunter of the Dark stands not as a monster tale, but as a ritual of epistemic failure. It dramatizes Lovecraft's core idea, that the pursuit of knowledge beyond human limits leads not to answers, but to the collapse of the one who asks. In our next case, this dynamic intensifies, but through dreams, not observation. We turn now to the ED, Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where Nyarlathotep leaves the shadows and takes the stage. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath occupies a unique space within Lovecraft's canon. It is his longest sustained narrative, and the most direct exploration of the Dreamlands, a parallel dimension shaped by thought, memory, and archetype. Though it operates in a more fantastical register than his horror stories, its final pages return us to the core concerns of cosmic dread. And it is here, at the climax, that Nyarlathotep fully emerges, not simply as a being of horror, but as a cosmic manipulator of desire itself. The story follows Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's recurring stand-in for the dreamer scholar. Carter seeks the majestic city of his dreams, Kadath, and believes it to be a vision of the Great Ones. The journey takes him across surreal geographies, through waking death, lunar empires, and timeless temples. Nyarlathotep is not seen until the very end, but he has been orchestrating Carter's path all along. This slow build is critical. It frames the god not as intruder, but as narrative architect, present in absence, guiding events without revealing his hand. When Nyarlathotep finally appears, his tone is casual, almost amused. He does not rage or threaten. He explains. And what he explains is devastating. Kadath is not a holy city, but a projection of Carter's earthly nostalgia, a fantasy reconstruction of his childhood home. Carter, in seeking transcendence, has chased a lie of his own making. "You have dreamed too well, O wise archdreamer," Nyarlathotep tells him. "For you are now trapped in a world you cannot understand, seeking gods that never called you." Here, Nyarlathotep plays his most essential role. He reveals the self-deception at the heart of the quest. This moment flips the narrative structure. What seemed to be a heroic journey is exposed as a closed loop of longing. Nyarlathotep offers Carter not destruction, but truth. Yet that truth annihilates meaning. The gods he sought were indifferent. The purpose he followed was his own projection. This is not a punishment, but a demonstration. Nyarlathotep, again, performs rather than explains. He walks Carter through the logic of his collapse, kindly, patiently, fatally. Philosophically, this reflects a profound inversion of the heroic myth. In traditional epics, from the Odyssey to the Divine Comedy, the journey leads to revelation, purification, or return. In Dream Quest, the journey reveals only circularity and futility. The dreamer is trapped in the echo chamber of his own illusions. Nyarlathotep becomes the desecrated Virgil, the anti-guide who leads not to heaven or hell, but to epistemic exhaustion. We must pause here to emphasize what Lovecraft has achieved. Unlike the Haunter of the Dark, where Nyarlathotep is horror in motion, here he is the structure of the world itself. His power is not physical or magical, but interpretive. He reveals that Carter's world was always rigged against coherence. Even the Dreamlands, so rich, so vivid, are not stable. They exist only to betray the dreamer. Nyarlathotep embodies that betrayal with a smile. This role links back to the being's mythic function. As the soul and messenger of the Outer Gods, Nyarlathotep is never the creator of horror. He is its translator. He delivers realization without mercy, understanding without relief. In Dream Quest, he tells Carter the truth not to harm him, but because truth itself is incompatible with human desire. This is Lovecraft's bleakest message. Not that gods are cruel, but that they are indifferent to the structures we build around them. Intertextually, this story binds many of Lovecraft's worlds. We encounter references to places from the White Ship, Cephalies, and the Cats of Ulthar. Yet it is Nyarlathotep who emerges as the final authority, a being who navigates both dream and waking and collapses the distinction. His function bridges genres. Mythic fantasy becomes cosmic horror, and the whimsical becomes fatal. And still, the dream quest of unknown Kadath never reduces Nyarlathotep to a villain. He does not harm Carter. He simply shows him what was always true. In this, he becomes not the enemy of the dream, but its correction. The price of knowledge is not death. It is the knowledge that nothing outside the self will validate it. As we move forward, we must ask how such a being could survive beyond Lovecraft's own pen. What happens when others take up this figure, reinterpreting it, revising it, distorting it further? That question leads us to the expansions of Derleth and others, where Nyarlathotep becomes not just a literary device, but a contested symbol. Nyarlathotep's presence within Lovecraft's own work is deliberately ambiguous, multifaceted, and elusive. But in the hands of later writers, particularly those responsible for shaping the so-called Cthulhu Mythos after Lovecraft's death, this figure began to harden into something more concrete. It is here, in these expansions, that we observe a transformation from protean principle to classifiable antagonist. And in this evolution, something essential is lost. Not clarity, but ambiguity itself. The most influential of these interpreters was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and co-founder of Arkham House. Derleth attempted to impose structure on Lovecraft's deliberately unstructured cosmology. He divided the mythos into elemental forces, fire, air, water, earth, and posited a moral conflict between benevolent elder gods and malevolent great old ones. Within this framework, Nyarlathotep became aligned with the element of air, a chaotic emissary of evil, clearly serving Azathoth in a satanic hierarchy. This was not a distortion for Derleth. It was an attempt to rescue coherence. But in doing so, he flattened Nyarlathotep into something closer to a demon. This shift is clearest in stories, like The Dweller in Darkness, where Nyarlathotep is portrayed not as a conceptual contaminant, but as a malicious being that chooses to inflict horror. It is summoned like a traditional entity, responds to ritual, and behaves with intention. The philosophical complexity of Lovecraft's original, the ambiguity of intention, the unknowability of purpose, is largely absent. Nyarlathotep becomes a villain, not a vector of collapse. The horror becomes narrative instead of existential. We must pause here to recognize the irony. Lovecraft's refusal to define the divine was precisely what made his work unsettling. It resisted categorization. Derleth's mythologizing, while popular, created a usable cosmology, one that could be referenced, gamified, and serialized. It also made Nyarlathotep more approachable, more predictable. As a result, later adaptations in film, games, and novels often inherit Derleth's Nyarlathotep, a shape-shifting trickster with evil intentions, rather than Lovecraft's epistemological breakdown made flesh. Yet even within later literature, some authors pushed back. Robert Bloch, a correspondent of Lovecraft, maintained a more cryptic version of Nyarlathotep in stories like The Faceless God, where he appears as a silent Egyptian statue, more presence than character. Ramsey Campbell continued this legacy in the 1970s and 80s, situating Nyarlathotep within modern British landscapes. His versions were urban, indirect, psychological, echoing the subtle inflections of the original. In Campbell's The Render of the Veils, for example, a character discovers that beneath reality lies a writhing horror that not only sees you, but intends you to see it. This retains the key Lovecraftian reversal. Knowledge is not power, but surrender. Role-playing games, especially Call of Cthulhu, 1981, further expanded Nyarlathotep's reach. Here, the being appears in multiple forms. The Black Pharaoh, the Bloated Woman, the Howler, and Darkness, each designed as a scenario for players to encounter and perhaps survive. While this multiplicity honors Lovecraft's idea of masks and forms, it also translates the god into a cataloged threat. This gamification of the unknowable reflects a broader trend. As Nyarlathotep becomes more popular, it becomes more knowable. But each act of definition pushes it further from its original function. Popular media followed suit. Nyarlathotep appears, often unnamed or loosely referenced, in manga, e.g. Uzumaki by Junji Ito, anime, Demon Bane, and films, The Void, The Mist, Event Horizon. In many of these, it serves as the symbol of madness, a figure whose approach distorts reality. But again, the risk persists, flattening the concept into a horror type rather than a horror function. When Nyarlathotep becomes just another monster, it loses what once made it uniquely corrosive, the fact that it was never truly a monster at all. Still, not all reinterpretations diminish its power. In experimental horror fiction, such as Laird Barron's The Croning or Caitlin R. Kiernan's Agents of Dreamland, Nyarlathotep's logic persists. It infects through language, appears as rumor, and alters perception without explanation. These works do not explain, they allude. They allow Nyarlathotep to remain a hypothesis, not a character. Ultimately, these later expansions confirm a pattern. The more clearly Nyarlathotep is defined, the less effective it becomes. Its horror lies not in power or form, but in function, the disruption of perception, the betrayal of thought, the undoing of sense. It is most terrifying when it remains a suggestion, not an event. And so, we leave the literary field behind and turn to the world beyond fiction. For the being that Lovecraft never claimed to believe in has left fingerprints across subcultures, rumors, and even psychological frameworks. In the next section, we trace its cultural and psychological afterlife, where myth bleeds into memory. Outside the boundaries of fiction, Nyarlathotep has escaped into cultural imagination in strange and subtle ways, not as belief, but as rumor. What began as a literary invention now circulates in fringe forums, digital folklore, and whispered online myths. It has become one of those names, like Mothman or the Slender Man, that lingers just beyond credibility, suspended in ambiguity. But unlike other urban legends, Nyarlathotep carries with it a different weight, the appearance of authenticity, sharpened by Lovecraft's deliberate use of pseudo-historical framing. Even during Lovecraft's lifetime, readers occasionally mistook references to the Necronomicon or Nyarlathotep as genuine occult artifacts. This confusion deepened as occult revival groups in the 1960s and 70s, most notably those adjacent to the Church of Satan and Discordianism, intentionally blurred lines between fiction and esoteric practice. Rituals invoking Nyarlathotep began appearing in self-published grimoires and online archives like sacredtexts.com, often as part of hoaxes or psychic experiments. These were rarely serious, but seriousness was never required. The figure's power lies not in belief, but in possibility. In modern internet lore, supposed sightings of Nyarlathotep, usually described as a tall man in a dark coat with an unreadable face, appear in creepypasta, ARGs, alternate reality games, and fictional redacted documents. One common motif involves a character hearing a voice without breath just before losing time or experiencing a disjointed reality. The being never appears directly. It is always one step removed, described by others, implied in distortion, glimpsed in mirror logic. This mimics its role in Lovecraft, a presence you do not see, but that has already seen you. More than any other figure from the mythos, Nyarlathotep is treated by the internet as potentially real, not in the sense of religious worship, but as a placeholder for patterns we cannot explain. UFO forums, liminal horror subreddits, and digital horror ARGs frequently borrow its attributes: masks, distorted messages, induced madness. And though most participants understand the reference, the language of sincerity remains. Stories are written not as fiction, but as fragments, just like Lovecraft intended. This blurring of truth and fiction connects to Nyarlathotep's core function, epistemic sabotage. The being enters narratives that pretend to be real. It does not demand belief. It creates unease about what others might believe. And in this, it mirrors how modern conspiracy theory functions. The question is never, is this real? But what if it were? That doubt is the infection. That pause is the summoning. We must consider why this figure, above all others, migrates so easily into rumor. The answer is structural. Nyarlathotep is designed to be misunderstood. It never takes one form. It never acts clearly. It appears in dreams, in fragmented speech, in contradictory roles. This makes it ideally suited to modern folklore, where virality depends on suggestiveness, not detail. It is not the most powerful being Lovecraft imagined, but it is the most narratively mobile. A name, a voice, a distortion in the data. These real sightings, whether sincere or performative, reveal something deeper than fandom. They show that Nyarlathotep, as a concept, resonates with modern anxieties, the fear of systems we cannot see, of forces that communicate without clarity, of being watched by something not hostile, but curious. The myth persists not because we believe it, but because it fits the shape of the unknown we now fear. In the next section, we move from myth to media, tracing how film, games, and music have reinterpreted Nyarlathotep not as monster, but as atmosphere. The question is no longer, who is he? But how do we render something that cannot be known? Nyarlathotep's transition into visual and interactive media reveals something telling. Creators rarely attempt to portray it directly. Instead, they borrow its logic. Distortion, multiplicity, epistemic decay, and embed it within narrative structure, sound design, or player experience. The result is not a recognizable villain, but an atmosphere of destabilization. Film, games, and music do not depict Nyarlathotep so much as simulate contact with its essence. In film, few examples name the entity outright, yet its influence permeates the genre of cosmic horror. The Void, 2016, for instance, centers on a cult that believes they can transcend death by summoning an ancient being through ritual and dimensional collapse. The creature's humanoid intermediaries, obsession with transformation, and reality-warping presence echo Nyarlathotep's mythic behavior, especially the version seen in The Haunter of the Dark. Event Horizon, 1997, while ostensibly science fiction, follows the same trajectory. A portal to knowledge becomes a gate to incomprehensible suffering. The ship is not haunted by a demon. It has seen too much, and now radiates cognitive ruin. Video games often go further, borrowing Lovecraft's thematic tools to structure gameplay itself. Bloodborne, 2015, though set in a Victorian nightmare, builds its entire world on the collapse of reality through forbidden contact with higher entities. The Great Ones speak in dreams, mutate the city's inhabitants, and offer knowledge that leads only to madness. Nyarlathotep is never named, but its function, dream intrusion, manipulative wisdom, masked forms, drives the player's descent. Similarly, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, features explicit mythos content and a scene where contact with an unseen cosmic presence fractures the protagonist's sanity in real time. The screen shakes, dialogue loops, controls falter, madness becomes mechanical. Music, particularly in experimental and metal genres, has also absorbed Nyarlathotep as a thematic anchor. Bands like Portal and the Great Old Ones create sonic landscapes that reject conventional structure, dissonant rhythms, indistinct lyrics, suffocating atmospheres. The result is less about storytelling and more about inducing psychological vertigo. In interviews, some artists explicitly cite Nyarlathotep as muse, not because of its actions, but because of its tone. A force that communicates just enough to disturb, never enough to clarify. These adaptations share a common pattern. They avoid exposition. Unlike many horror figures, Nyarlathotep resists backstory. Viewers, players, and listeners are expected to feel rather than understand. This aligns precisely with Lovecraft's original intent. When the god speaks in stories, it is not to inform, it is to destabilize. Modern creators have preserved this method by translating it into medium-specific techniques. In film, through flickering frames and unreliable narration. In games, through disintegrating controls. In music, through overwhelming textures that resist rhythm and resolve. But why does this being persist while others fade into cliché? The answer lies in its incompleteness. Unlike Cthulhu, which has been rendered into plush toys and pop culture symbols, Nyarlathotep refuses to settle. It remains unresolved, unpinnable. This makes it useful across genres and decades. Creators don't have to replicate its form. They only need to replicate its effect. That flexibility is rare in horror mythology. We return then to the core function. Nyarlathotep does not appear. It happens. It is a shift in perception. A suggestion that something knows more than you do and is choosing to show just enough to let your mind tear itself apart. Modern media, in its best moments, has not attempted to tame this being. Instead, it has continued Lovecraft's experiment. What happens when you let the audience think they understand? Just long enough to be destroyed by the illusion? Next, we look at how this logic has extended beyond media, into subcultures, esoteric movements, and academic theory. The question becomes not just how Nyarlathotep appears, but how it circulates through thought itself. Nyarlathotep's afterlife extends far beyond fiction and media. It has been absorbed into living subcultures, refracted through occult experimentation, postmodern theory, and even meme culture. Not through belief in its literal existence, but through the conceptual utility it offers. A shape for chaos, a metaphor for systems that lie, speak, and mutate without end. In these spaces, Nyarlathotep becomes less a character and more a kind of mental virus, passed between disciplines and ideologies without ever solidifying. Among esoteric circles, particularly in fringe occultism and chaos magic, Nyarlathotep has taken root not as a deity, but as an interface for uncertainty. Practitioners in Discordian and post-Thelemic traditions have cited the figure in rituals meant to disrupt symbolic order as an agent of transformation by destabilization. Unlike classical gods, who represent fixed values, Nyarlathotep offers flux. It is invoked not to bring clarity, but to welcome ambiguity. Texts like the Book of Lies, Crowley, and later zines from the 1980s often used Nyarlathotep as a symbol of unfiltered gnosis, the arrival of too much understanding, too fast, without context or safeguards. In digital spaces, the god has become a meme, but not a joke. Twitter accounts, Discord bots, and AI-driven art installations use its name to deliver fragmented prophecy, procedurally generated riddles, or surreal text glitches. The format mirrors its literary origin, language that appears coherent just long enough to fracture meaning. A Twitter post claiming Nyarlathotep is trending again. Nobody remembers why. Do not look directly at the source. Functions not as parody, but as a performance of the figure's cultural logic. Even when unserious, it performs a genuine effect, a moment of epistemic instability. Academia, too, has appropriated the figure, especially within post-structuralist and media theory. Scholars have likened Nyarlathotep to the hyper-object, a term coined by Timothy Morton to describe entities too vast, too distributed, and too entangled to be grasped in full. Others interpret it as a metaphor for late capitalist information flow, a system that communicates constantly but never honestly. In this light, Nyarlathotep is not a god, but an algorithm, a presence that mediates between systems, manipulates attention, and dissolves certainty. The being becomes a case study in the horror of the interpreted, not just the unknown. Subculturally, its presence is more diffuse, but no less potent. In online communities centered around liminality, glitch aesthetics, and unreality, e.g. analog horror fans, ARG creators, vaporwave musicians, Nyarlathotep acts as a symbol of deliberate miscommunication. He becomes the unofficial patron of corrupted VHS signals, lost files, or websites that rewrite themselves while being read. In some cases, the character is embedded into mythologies that pretend not to be stories, creating recursive loops where participants can no longer tell what is fiction and what is performance. What persists across all these appropriations is the same core function. Nyarlathotep does not stand for something. It disrupts whatever it is placed within. Whether in sacred texts, theory journals, or Discord threads, its presence signifies that a system of thought, belief, narrative is now unstable. That's why it survives. Unlike other mythological imports, it does not ask for allegiance. It simply waits for coherence to falter. Next, we return to the individual mind. For if Nyarlathotep operates across systems and cultures, what does it leave behind in the psyche? What happens when the encounter becomes internal? When it is not a story or a ritual, but a pattern of thought that can no longer be unlearned? That is our final threshold. The final implication of Nyarlathotep is not cultural, literary, or symbolic. It is psychological. What remains after the stories, the sightings, the subcultures, is a cognitive trace, a pattern of thought that destabilizes the mind even without a monster. The most unsettling truth Lovecraft proposed was that madness is not a break from reality. It is a glimpse of too much of it. Nyarlathotep does not punish with terror. It rewards curiosity with collapse. The figure lingers in the psyche because it represents a rupture in the way meaning is constructed. It speaks to a fear deeper than death or violence, the fear that understanding might be not only insufficient, but dangerous. Nyarlathotep embodies the trauma of realization, that gods do not care, that knowledge is not linear, and that the structure of reality is not aligned with the structure of the human mind. It is not a thing we fear, but a result we cannot undo. This makes it a perfect symbol for modern anxieties. In an era of information overload, algorithmic suggestion, and invisible systems that observe, record, and redirect us, the idea of a communicative malevolence, something that responds to you, adapts to you, yet remains forever outside your reach, is no longer just fiction. Nyarlathotep becomes a metaphor for how it feels to navigate a world saturated with signals that may not be meant for you, but still affect you. Its horror is not irrational. It's hyper-rational, a mind turned inward until it burns through its own frame. Clinical psychology offers echoes of this concept in dissociative disorders, in derealization, in the breakdown of narrative identity. The moment when language no longer maps to experience, when perception becomes untrustworthy, that is Nyarlathotep's domain. It is the intrusion of intelligence where intelligence no longer helps, where explanation becomes a trap. Importantly, Lovecraft's writings never offer tools to fight this being. There are no wards, no spells, no chosen ones. This absence is central. Nyarlathotep is not meant to be opposed. It is meant to reveal something you cannot unsee. And once seen, it changes how you look at everything else. That is why it persists. It is not a myth you remember. It is a cognitive rearrangement that remembers you. We must leave the door open here. There is no final meaning to extract, no thesis to prove. Nyarlathotep was never meant to resolve. It was meant to circulate, to infect, to whisper. It walks through stories, subcultures, media, and minds not because it demands attention, but because it requires interpretation without ever giving permission. In doing so, it becomes the most potent horror of all, the idea you cannot disprove, the thought you cannot silence, the truth that does not care if you believe. We have reached the end of the analysis, but the figure does not end. It remains in what you now suspect, in what you might now begin to notice, in the stories you revisit, the data you question, the symbols that no longer seem still. The final horror, after all, is this. Nyarlathotep has already spoken, and you were already listening.